Hey, out there, you can see me okay? I had this figured out. This way into. It's time for our illustration. Hello, out there. Have about another minute before we officially begin. Okay, so it is officially 12 o'clock on my end, and so I'm not sure if we'll have a few people join us a little bit later, but I want to be timely with my talk today, and so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Okay, for those of you who are joining for the first time, hello, how are you? Good to see you. My name is Dr. Renita. How you doing? And I'm a licensed psychologist in Maryland and in DC. And so I am doing this hour of breakthrough to basically educate the community about mental health concerns. I was really inspired to do this just in light of everything that's been happening in our world that I really believe needs to have some light shed on, maybe what are the mental health factors that might be involved. And so that was part of the reason for this, just to kind of get the information out there and just to kind of let you all know that I am out here providing mental health services and information, and help is not too far away. It's just a matter of a phone call or an email, honestly. So I am the owner and operator of Breakthroughs Psychological Services. It is a private practice in the DC, Maryland area. So I actually have two offices. I have an office in Bowie, Maryland, and one in Lanham, Maryland. I don't currently have an office in DC, but who knows, maybe in the future that might be something I'll explore. The best way to reach me if you're interested in mental health services is through email or telephone. Email is info@drrenitagabriel.com if you're interested in services, or you can call me on my business line, which is 240-257-6718. Okay? All right, so I'm going to just go ahead and get started on the topic for today. Well, actually, before I get started, I had two major announcements that I wanted you all to know about. The first is that there will be a local author event at the Barnes & Nobles in Bowie, Maryland. And so as a few of you may know, I am an author, a newly published author. I wrote a book called The Point of It All, A Faith-Based Guide to Successful Living. And you can purchase that book online at barnesandnobles.com. You can also purchase it at zulonpress.com, which is the self-publisher that I use, or amazon.com. A lot of people go to Amazon as well. But you can get it from me in person on this coming Sunday, September 23rd, from 11 to 4 p.m. at the Barnes & Noble in Bowie, Maryland. Okay, so I hope you guys can make it out from 11 to 4. The other announcement that I wanted to make today was to let you all know that I do offer a group, a support group, through Changing Focus. It's an organization that supports individuals who are newly divorced or in the midst of divorce and separation. And so I do host a support group for those individuals who are going through separation or divorce. It's in Crofton, Maryland. And you can, just drop in and check it out a couple of times before you, make any commitments to the group. But it may be helpful for you if you're transitioning in that way. Okay, so let's talk about stress and anxiety. The goal for today, so much could be said about this topic. There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of, subheadings within this talk in general. But today I did want to make it more of a general talk. So what I hope to accomplish in today's talk is to basically let you know what stress and anxiety are, make the distinction between the two, tell you about, a little bit about what are some of the specific types of anxiety disorders, and then also provide strategies or helpful tips for managing stress and anxiety. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. I hope that's what you gather from today. And again, if you need further assistance, you can either contact me directly, to start a therapeutic relationship, or you can actually find a provider on www.psychologytoday.com if you are interested in psychological services or mental health services. The information presented today is supposed to be informational and it doesn't constitute a professional relationship. But if you need that, and we'll talk about, signs and symptoms that you may need that, you can have that available to you through psychologytoday.com or myself. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. So stress, what is stress? I think a lot of times people will say I'm stressed out, or they throw around the word stress in a very casual way. But I think it's important to really understand what we mean when we say stress. So stress is basically the body's response to change, right? So a lot of the times when we're talking about we're stressed out, we're talking about how we're responding to the stressors in our lives. So stressors are those things that can produce a stress response. Okay, so stress again is the body's response to change. I thought I'd do a little illustration here to give you a good sense of what stress is. And so I'm going to use the example of a balloon. I don't think I'm the first person to do this example. I'm not sure. I thought about it, but that's not to say that there's not other examples of people doing this on YouTube to talk about stress. I don't know though. Okay, so imagine that the balloon is your body, okay? And so I am going to blow the balloon. So my breath is going to function as a stressor, okay? So here we go. Okay, so basically we saw that in response to the stressor, my breath, we saw that the body expanded. We're pretending the balloon is the body. It expanded. So that's one response to this external, well, it's really internal because it's in the balloon, stressor. Okay, and so that's kind of how your body operates. You can imagine that as I keep putting air in the balloon, it's going to keep expanding to the point where it cannot expand anymore. And we all know what happens when that happens. So I want you to kind of put a dime in that, and we'll come back to it when we talk about chronic stress and the effects of prolonged stress. But this was just to give you an example of what a stressor looks like and how the body responds to a stressor. So I have actually come up with an illustration. I have learned not to write because everything looks backwards when I'm trying to record. But what I did was I pictorially demonstrated what are some of the ways that your body responds to stress. So there are really three core ways that your body responds to a stressor or has a stress response. And it responds to stress in the cognitive, the thought process. It also responds to stress physiologically or physically. So this is supposed to be a man. And then also in terms of your feelings. So the heart sort of denotes your feelings. So these are all areas that are impacted by stress, and the body responds to stress in these three areas. So when we're talking about our mental, so this is probably a better word, mental, we are impacted with our thoughts. So we may have anxious thoughts or thoughts that promote stress. We also may have issues with concentration. And even memory. So these are all mental responses to stress. In terms of physical or physiological, so this refers to more so like the functions of the body, and this is the actual body. We may have racing heart. Once again, I did say I wasn't going to write, but I couldn't help myself. Racing heart, sweaty palms, GI problems. So, you know, we might have an upset stomach as a response to stress. So these are just some of the physical things that can happen. This list is not exhaustive. I'm just trying to, you know, make a point here. In terms of our feelings, when we're stressed, we may feel angry or agitated, sad. We can also feel worried, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about anxiety. Again, the list is not exhaustive. These are just some examples of how the body may respond to stress. Okay, so wanted to make sure that, you know, we have a clear sense that there are three areas that are impacted: the mental, the physical or physiological, and feelings. And they actually all inform each other. And so there's a connection here between all of these areas. Okay, so oftentimes when we talk about stress, we talk about it in terms of a negative experience. We don't often see stress as a positive experience at all. But some of you may be aware that stress can be positive. So the positive stress is referred to as eustress, and that is EUSTRESS. And that type of stress tends to focus us. It tends to motivate us. It tends to be short term. Oftentimes we're able to manage that stress better because it's within our perceived ability to cope with that level of stress. So some examples of eustress would be a promotion at work. You know, you're excited about your promotion, but you're also maybe a little nervous about performing well. Having a new baby. I think a few of us who are attending this Facebook Live know all about having a new baby. Moving, again, it's it's an exciting time. It can be an exciting time, but it can also be a stressful time, but in a positive way. So that's eustress when I talk about positive stressors. Most of us, when we talk about stress, we're familiar with the negative aspect of stress. So we talk about de-stress. De-stress is negative stress, and that can be directly linked to anxiety or worry. It can be short-term or long-term, acute versus chronic. We'll talk about that a little bit. A lot of times when we have the de-stress, we feel overwhelmed because what we're dealing with exceeds what we perceive we can cope with. And so that's why we end up feeling de-stress. The feeling part of that is unpleasant. We're not able to perform as well. Remember, I talked about how some of the mental aspects of stress can be loss of concentration, problems with memory. Your performance can go down. And a lot of us know this, but it can also lead to mental health and physical problems. Interesting statistic that I learned, or that I was reminded of, is that stress is linked to 6 of the leading causes of death. They are heart disease. Stress is directly linked to that. Cancer. Stress is directly linked to that. Lung ailments. There's a connection with that as well. Accidents. There's a connection. Cirrhosis of the liver, and suicide. So this might not be surprising to some of you who are viewing this, but it's just interesting to see it in print. I think a lot of us intuitively, think that stress, it can't be good for you. This feels bad, so it can't be good for you. Well, yeah, statistically, it's not. It's connected to some of these leading causes of death, which is why it's so important to address stress. And because it's something that's a matter of life. Everybody's going to experience stress because it's just the body's response to change. we often talk about, we don't talk about alleviating and curing people from stress. We talk about stress management and helping people learn how to manage stress as opposed to completely overcoming stress, because that's not possible based on our working definition of what stress is. Okay. I don't know if there are any questions, since we do have a couple of people attending. I don't want to call anybody's name out, but I appreciate your support. I don't know if we have any questions. I think maybe now is a good place to pause to ask if anyone has any questions. Okay, well, if there are no questions, I'm going to continue. So when we talk about acute stress, we're talking about, sort of a short-lived and severe sort of experience. So there is a condition, a mental health condition called acute stress disorder, and a lot of times it can be a precursor to PTSD. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of times when people, experience vehicular accidents or some sort of accident that could be, traumatic, they would naturally experience, physiological, mental, and feeling components or experiences associated with stress, because that makes sense, right? They just had this particular stressor that happened to them, and so they have the resulting effects, the mental effects, the physical effects, and the emotional effects that are associated with that. Well, acute stress disorder is time sensitive, right? So maybe within the first month or two, I think once you get past 3 months, then you're moving into maybe a different sort of issue. So that's again, acute, short-lived, usually severe response to a stressor. Chronic tends to be, prolonged, as the name suggests. It's a prolonged state of stress, or, responding to the stressor, and, it's a continued duration. Remember the balloon example, I talked about blowing a balloon. So just imagine if I just kept blowing this balloon, I just kept blowing it and kept blowing it. Eventually it's going to pop. That's a good way to think about chronic stress, and just kind of having that, and then just it just adds and builds and builds and builds. Another thought that I had was the pin, like if you were to take a pin and burst the balloon, that's another stressor coming from the outside that could adversely impact the body. So those are the two illustrations and thoughts I had about that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about anxiety. So a lot of times when people talk about anxiety and stress, they use it interchangeably. They may be really talking about stress, but they'll say anxiety. And so they're a little different. They have some similarities in that there is a mental component to anxiety, there's a physiological component, and there's a feelings component to anxiety. Much of the physical part, or the physiological part, feels very similar to stressors. And some of the thoughts that are associated with anxiety are similar to the thoughts that you might have when you're stressed. And some of the concentration and memory issues, those can also be consistent in anxiety. But the difference is anxiety really focuses on fear and worry. It really, that's the key thing about anxiety. So I think it's important here to talk about fight or flight response. So we were designed to respond to threats using our autonomic nervous system. So that, I shouldn't say using it, because it automatically sort of kicks in. And so that allows us to, flee from danger or stay and fight in the face of danger. I believe that's how we were designed. And so a lot of the times in anxiety, this normal, natural part of who we are gets kicked into overdrive. And so we may respond in the way that we would respond in light of a actual threat. We might respond that way when there isn't really a perceived threat, like our autonomic nervous system just sort of kicks into overdrive. And so you experience the physiological symptoms, so the racing heart, you can't, problems breathing, lightheadedness, sweaty palms, just the, GI stuff, just different things that are associated with, with that fight or flight sort of response, that adrenaline racing. And so those are things that you may experience sort of out of the blue. With stress, a lot of the times we know where the stress comes from. We know that it's an external stressor, or we may know that it's an internal stressor. So when I say internal stressor, I mean sort of like thoughts and things that sort of get the best of us that we're stressing about. But with anxiety, especially as I'm thinking about a type of anxiety called panic disorder, it seems like it comes out of the blue, and we're not able to identify where it's coming from. So that's another thing that distinguishes anxiety from stress. So again, the focus is fear. The fight or flight response sort of kicks into gear. It's really like a fear, worried type of situation, and and there's not really a pinpointing cause. A lot of times we don't really know what it is. Now, stress can certainly exacerbate anxiety and impact anxiety. So, stress is just not good in general. So you don't want, if you mix the two, if you already have an underlying, anxiety disorder, and then you put a stressor on top of that, it's just going to make it worse. Like stress makes, de-stress makes a lot of things just worse. So that's one way to look at that. Okay, so I'm going to take a second to talk about, hopefully it was clear what I was saying about the fight or flight response, how it kind of goes into overdrive, and that's sort of what we experience when we experience those physical symptoms associated with anxiety. There's also a mental component of that. A lot of times we catastrophize. It's a concept known as catastrophication or catastrophizing. And so that's when we tell ourselves that the worst case scenario is going to happen. Anxiety is very future oriented. It thinks about the worst case scenario, so it's not really present oriented. The mental part really focuses on the worst case scenario. And it's like, oh my gosh, the worst case scenario is going to happen. We're having thoughts about, what would happen if such and such happens. And then the feelings part of that, again, the worry. And sometimes you can have depression and sadness around, experiencing anxiety. So there's a lot of overlap and connection. Okay, so just a few things that may need clinical attention and may need, some sort of mental health intervention. Generalized anxiety disorder. I'm just going to talk. I'm not going to, go through the whole diagnostic criteria for that, but that has a lot to do with excessive worry and worry about most things. It's one thing to sort of be worried about a test or to be kind of have some anxiety, when you're speaking in front of people. But it's another thing to sort of have this pervasive, like you're worried about every single thing. I don't know, your children, your house, your car, just whatever. And it just pervades your life. So that is a generalized anxiety disorder in a nutshell. Another type of anxiety sort of, or kind of gets lumped under anxiety, is obsessive compulsive disorder. So with that, there are the mental part that's kicking in. So the mental part is the obsession. So you might have an obsession with contamination. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm dirty, or my hands are dirty. Or you might have an obsession with, maybe loss, or somebody taking something from you, or like a religious preoccupation. These are all things that affect your cognition, your thoughts. And so as a result, to sort of squelch the anxiety that comes from having these obsessions, you act in compulsive ways. So you engage in behaviors that sort of help you minimize this experience, these obsessions. It kind of helps, kind of quiet them a little bit, and makes you less anxious. So that's why people engage in the compulsive behavior. So with the hand washing, a lot of times people who have a obsession about cleanliness or contamination, they'll feel less anxiety if they engage in multiple compulsions or multiple actions that involve them washing their hands several times a day. So that's OCD. Panic disorder, I think I talked a little bit about that before, when this all of a sudden out of the blue, you have problems with shortness of breath, you're feeling dizzy or lightheaded. A lot of times people talk about having the experience that they're having a heart attack or they're about to die. Sometimes people can relate it to, having anxiety of going over bridges. I've heard people talk about driving over bridges. They all of a sudden get hit with a panic attack. And then sometimes people are just out of the blue. They're getting hit with a panic attack. A lot of times they're around people. And so some people avoid going out into public when they have panic attacks because they don't want to, be seen as, like something's wrong with them, or they're afraid. They don't know what's going to happen if they're around so many people, and so they develop a condition called agoraphobia that's also associated or can be associated with panic attacks. So talked a little bit about that. Social anxiety disorder, having, these anxious symptoms like we talked about earlier, but really relegated to social experiences. So being in, social environments and being around other people, you have all of these symptoms that we talked about. Phobias, sort of that's like an irrational fear of a particular thing. Some people have dog phobias, spider phobias, and things of that nature. But like I mentioned before, certainly if these things that I was talking about, the generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, panic disorder, a lot of times these things are very disruptive to people's lives, and that tends to bring them back into treatment or sends them to treatment. If you think that you're dealing with all of these or some of these, most people don't have all of them, but if you find that you're dealing with one or a few, you think you might be dealing with a few of these, I really would suggest that you try to talk to somebody and get an assessment of what may be going on. I don't ever think therapy is a bad thing. Even if it's just to sort of deal with some transitions in your life, or just to talk with somebody to make sure that you're doing and thinking in a way that is beneficial to your life and can help you. Okay, so that is that with regard to really sort of delineating the difference between anxiety and stress and talking about specific anxiety disorders. Okay, so now I was thinking about going into, if there are not any questions, I was going to go into ways that we can manage our stress and anxiety. Given that stress and anxiety target both our mental, our physical and physiological, and our feelings, the ways to manage them do target these areas. One article that I had gave a list of about 13 different things, and so I'm going to talk about that list but also expound upon it based on my experience with these particular issues. So one recommendation was to keep a positive attitude. I think that's a good point, and it's important, but I think additionally it's important to learn to appraise your situations differently. A lot of the times when I talked about like the mental part, and a lot of us tend to, or some of us who are dealing with these issues tend to catastrophize, right? So we may think that oh my gosh, if I don't get this paper done, then I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail at my career, or I'm going to be a failure in life, or what have you. So that's like for them, that's the worst case scenario, and that's just a horrible outlook, right? And so we have to really try to look at our situation a little bit differently. Well, maybe you didn't do a good job on the paper, but does that really mean that you're a failure at life, or you're going to fail in your career? Let's really kind of try to look at that situation a little bit differently. And it's been my experience that when we challenge people to do that, they are able to have less anxious thoughts and less catastrophizing when they're able to look at a situation and appraise it a little bit differently than what their automatic thought is of, oh my gosh, is it in the world, or is this worst case scenario? And again, I'm not trying to trivialize. I've struggled as well with some of these thoughts. So, but I think it's important to sort of reappraise the situation so that it's more helpful and more realistic to what could be going on. Let's see. So one thing you could ask yourself is, well, what's the worst thing that could happen in this situation? I got an F on the paper. Is that the worst thing that could happen? Okay, can you live with that? I think I could live with getting an F. It's not the worst thing that could happen in the world. Also, be mindful of what are the actual facts. You know, a lot of times when we are praising our situation, we're not really basing ourselves in the moment or the current reality. We're thinking about like the future and what could happen, not sort of what has happened or what is happening. So also, you know, when you're praising a situation, you know, assess what the facts are. What are the facts? You know, are you a failure at life? Have there been other situations in your life where you haven't failed? And then the sort of related to keeping a positive attitude and reappraising your situations or praising your situations so that they're more realistic, is to accept the events that you cannot control. So look at the situations that are actually in your control and you know, work with those, but also recognize there are some things that are just not out of your control. You know, natural disaster, you know, getting laid off from a job. You know, those are things that are not in your control. And so sort of, you know, being able to accept those things. This statement here, it says be assertive instead of aggressive. So it says assert your feelings, opinions, or beliefs instead of becoming angry, defensive, or passive. I think this is a really good one because a lot of the times when we're not assertive in our communication, we can experience regret at being aggressive, perhaps, and coming at people the wrong way and not getting the result that we want. You know, we can also experience, you know, the stress and the negative impact that anger may have if you're coming at someone in an aggressive way, which can exacerbate your condition. And then a lot of the times, sometimes people don't assert themselves and don't say what they need to say at all. Like they're not aggressive, they're not assertive, they just don't say anything, they're passive. And so a lot of times that can be anxiety provoking or stressful because, you know, because you didn't say anything, you know, you're stuck, you know, doing something that you might not want to do or that might be stressing you or, overextending yourself. And so I think it's really good when you talk about being assertive is to talk about with people about boundaries, and it's important to talk about boundaries when you're thinking about being assertive as well. So, you know, figuring out, okay, what is the limit for you? I mean, we all have limitations, right? And I think a lot of the times we're not always mindful of that when we're stressed out. When we overcommit, we're not always thinking about, well, I have a limited amount of time, you know, energy, resources. We're just like, well, I just want to do it. It seems like a good thing, so let me just do it. But I would really encourage you to, you know, really assess those things for yourself. And that comes with, you know, making boundaries, which is connected to being assertive and letting people know. I think being assertive is letting people know what your boundaries are, and you don't have to do it in an aggressive way. So that's another conversation. Again, like I said, this topic, there's a lot of little offshoots from it that I think could be helpful for future hour of breakthroughs, which I hope, you know, people will tune into, and maybe I can get some additional guests to help me with these sort of things. Let's see. Another thing that can help managing stress and anxiety is to learn and practice relaxation techniques. A really big one that is really helpful that I've practiced in my own life and I've really encouraged clients to practice is this whole idea of mindfulness, being present in the moment. Like I said, because anxiety tends to be so future oriented and really kind of jumping to conclusions and thinking about the worst case scenario, it's not really something that's really present focused. So if you could you know, bring your mind and your thoughts to the present moment and be in the moment and, you know, often meditate, then that can definitely help with the mental part of anxiety and also the physiological part, you know, the racing thoughts and all of that, and the racing heartbeat and those sort of things. If you're really focused, you know, if you really try to bring your attention to your breathing and really are mindful about those things, it can really help. I would really recommend, you know, maybe checking out some YouTube videos about mindfulness and meditation. You know, again, if you feel like this is something that you really need help with, you know, call a counselor and they can definitely spend some time, you know, showing you techniques for engaging in mindfulness and meditation. Let's see. So yeah, that's something I really recommend. Some people do yoga, some people do Tai Chi. So those are all things that are promoting relaxation. Sometimes just breathing. I know that some of these things that I've mentioned involve really mindful breathing and really paying attention to your breath. You know, breathing can be so relaxing. If you're breathing the correct way, or a way that's relaxing, it can really make a difference. So that's a really good practice. Exercising regularly. So your body can fight stress better when it's fit. So you're kind of training your body so that, you know, when the stress does come, because like I said, stress is inevitable, you'll be ready for it. You'll be better equipped to manage it. And so that's important, to exercise regularly. Eat healthy, well-balanced meals. That is, you know, probably goes without saying. You know, the mind, body, and heart, they're all connected. So if I were to draw an arrow, it would show that everything is connected. And I just think that it was designed to be that way. So what you're putting in your body, how you're managing your body, what you're thinking about, those things are all, relevant and important when you're talking about stress management and anxiety. Let's see. Learn to manage your time more effectively, right? So we're talking about boundaries and also prioritization. I talk about some of these things in my book, just a little plug right there. I definitely talk about prioritization and, boundary making. It's difficult to have one without the other. Not everything in your life can be a priority, right? You have to kind of set things up so that they're really important. So definitely managing your time and trying to, orient your life around the things that are most important, and setting those things up as priorities. Make time for set limits appropriately and learn how to say no. So back to that boundaries conversation, learning how to say no, not overextending yourself. That's definitely a way to manage and manage that anxiety and stress. And make time for your hobbies, interests, and relaxation. That's also important. Getting enough rest and sleep. I think this kind of goes without saying, when we're talking about healthy bodies and taking care of our bodies, not putting in, a whole bunch of alcohol or illicit substances, or engaging in, behaviors that are damaging to the body. Seek out social support. So it's important to have a social support network. I think I talked a little bit about this too a couple months ago when I was talking about suicide prevention, how social support is really key. So you definitely want to have a group that you enjoy spending time with, that can build you up and help you out in tough times. And then lastly, seek treatment with a mental health provider. Someone that's trained in stress management. And there's some other techniques that people use. There's such a thing as biofeedback. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. I have not had, training in that area, but it's my understanding that it's really helpful. They really emphasize this part, the physiological part, and relaxation. And so that can be something that can be helpful as well in stress management and anxiety management. All right, you all. So I think that's all that I have for today. I didn't realize I would have had so much information, but it looks like it was quite a bit of information, and hopefully it was helpful information for you all. That's the most important thing. That's why this exists, the Hour of Breakthroughs. So if you don't have any questions, I'll leave a few moments for questions if you have questions. But if not, I am going to sign off. Any questions or comments at this time? Thank you so much for joining me, guys. And I will have, I can probably share some of these articles on my Facebook page so that people can, access them as they desire to do so. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope this information was helpful. Take care, everyone. Bye.